Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm George Jackson, Vice President of Events here at GovExec, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's discussion, The Modern Government, Pathways to Decarbonization. This program is the second installment in a two-part series that explores how government and industry work together on key public policy issues. As the title suggests, we'll focus on decarbonization today with three leaders in the field. Dr. Kim Spangler, she's Director of the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program and the Environment Security Technology Certification Program at the Department of Defense. Dr. Spangler, welcome. Did I get both titles correct?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Oliver Fritz is Director of Operational Energy in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environment and Energy Resilience. Ollie, welcome. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Josh Hesterman is Managing Director of Infrastructure and Climate Advisory at KPMG. Josh, how are you?
Doing well. Glad to be here. Thanks.
Dr. Spangler, kick things off. Those titles I mentioned, big. You're relatively new to the position, but with a really impressive background in weapons, energy, research, and more. Tell us about who you are, what you do for DoD.
Sure. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to be here today. So I am I'm a chemist actually by training, and over the last couple years of my career, I've really moved into the management of research and development programs for the Department of Defense. And so I have the good fortune now of running two large research and development programs out of the Department of Defense. And I also lead our innovation team actually in the same office as Ollie. And so I think we'll get to hear a little bit later from Ollie on how the innovation side that I lead and work on really nicely dovetails with the policy work that we do out of the office. But broadly within the Department of Defense, we are working on environment and energy issues across the spectrum. So my two programs work more on installation energy and installation environmental issues. And then I have a counterpart, Ms. Ruth Ann Darling, who leads the operational energy programs for prototyping and innovation.
What about you, Ollie? Tell us a little bit about your background, how decarbonization fits into that portfolio.
Sure. Well, I came to the Office of the Secretary of Defense by way of Air Force strategic planning on the air staff. And so I think that's sort of a perspective I bring to this, which is how do these initiatives align with military capability and resilience? And so I'm the Director for Operational Energy on the team here. And what that means is we're looking at the use of energy, meaning efficiency, but also use of different energy sources in our combat platforms. So ships, jets, combat vehicles, and contingency bases. Well, obviously today, I'll be able to talk about the full portfolio of how we look at this. But I think it is, it's instructive to, keep in mind we've got, basic set of executive orders, federal sustainability plan that sets out some pretty significant metrics and goals for the entire federal government and for the Department of Defense as a consequence. And alongside those climate imperatives are a set of mission imperatives. And I think that's where our team in the Office of Secretary of Defense really has a role to make sure that we're integrating those different imperatives in the right way, right? So that we are mitigating our climate footprint while at the same time increasing our capability, increasing our resilience, and really aligning with those objectives laid out in the recently issued National Defense Strategy.
So Josh, similarly, where does decarbonization fit into your portfolio at KPMG?
Yeah, well, I think at KPMG, it's a huge part of us just meeting the challenge of the climate risk and all the different aspects that were laid out in the climate executive order. So we see decarbonization as being, a primary way for us to kind of meet those mandates and those ambitions. What I spend a lot of my time personally doing is kind of porting over the work that we do in the commercial sector in terms of operational efficiency, facilities, et cetera, and trying to bring that into into our work with our public sector and government clients. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, obviously, and if we're going to address something together on the scale that climate change and that all its resident impacts we're going to have to band together and do it through our large agencies in a concerted effort.
Ali, your colleague, Dr. Spangler, mentioned this relationship between your two offices, innovation and policy. Josh mentioned this October 2021 executive order on climate and how it fits into the Biden administration's larger pillars. I'm hoping you can just give us a sense of what policy roadmaps or guidelines are currently out there for you in this field and how you use them internally as you work with Dr. Spangler to push that innovation envelope.
Sure. Well, so Executive Order 14057 and the supporting following federal sustainability plan are the really map out how federal operations are going to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And there's a variety of subcomponents to that about the use of carbon-free electricity, zero emission vehicles, the role that net zero building emissions fit into that, as well as net zero procurement of services and goods to support that. And so that really sets the framework, right? And so as I mentioned, then we're kind of translating that into the mission imperatives the Department of Defense has. And as we do that, we've got a series of tools or mechanisms we can use. And some of that is direct investment, right? Some of that is third-party financing. Some of that is coordinating with other federal agencies to increase our buying power, for instance, for renewable energy. And oftentimes, when it comes to innovation, the department's going to be following the commercial sector, right? We're going to be, certainly for, maybe it's certain parts of energy storage, renewable power generation, things like that. But for those certain parts of the DoD mission, whether that's on combat platforms or at installations, we're going to need to do some mission-focused innovation of our own, right? Whether that is about adapting existing commercial technology or developing all new technologies. But we want to make sure that both the investments that the military departments are making are in line with that and in line with our priorities. Also making sure that the resources that our own office oversees, right, these defense-wide research and development funds, that they are finely focused on making sure that our investments are in the right places and that we're doing the right things with those. And by that, I mean we're demonstrating them and we're testing them to make sure that they're meeting our mission requirements. And that's something that Kim's team does quite a bit of.
Kim, how do you effectively tap into that innovation base? Any best practices here? It just strikes me as such a new, maybe new isn't the right word, but field that's still in development. How do you drive that innovation in a really positive way?
So, and really to pull the thread on what Ali mentioned, for several years, we've had these 4 programs or the what we call RDT&E in the Department of Defense. So research, development, test, and evaluation. We've had this infrastructure, we've had funding. What we're doing right now in these 4 programs is making concerted efforts to ensure that we're able to draw on the substantial innovation that's in the US to adapt and demonstrate these technologies. So we have annual proposal calls where we make sure that we describe the problem that we're trying to address, but we don't prescribe the innovation. And so that's a really fine line that we walk there, because if we just said go innovate, we might not have something that's applicable to the Department of Defense. But at the same time, we know that we as managers have an idea of what might make a good technology investment, but we really depend on the innovation within academia, within our industry, within small businesses, within our federal partners, within our DoD labs to come to the table with new ideas. We do believe that we are on track with research and development investments to enable the 2045 net zero goals on our installations, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the operational energy side is going to prove more challenging. And so we're laying out paths, tech development pathways for both aspects, for the installation side and the operational energy side, so that we can meet those goals.
Josh, to Kim's point, talk about that industry component and maybe where you see those pockets of innovation happening around decarbonization right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever we're looking at decarbonization, we're trying to think about what the really big ticket items are that we have to address because of the criticality and the kind of urgency of what we've got in front of us. And so, I think of some of the areas like alternative fuels. We have a number of commercial clients who are looking at really either really innovative kind of first to market pathways for things like sustainable aviation fuel, or more likely over the next few years, just looking at commercializing and scaling those up to a place where they're more competitive, even on an unsubsidized basis with traditional fuels like jet fuel, et cetera. So I think that's going to be one major place that we see. I think the other is taking advantage of what we've kind of sown over the last decade or two in terms of putting sensors in and on everything. So we're all kind of familiar with the light switch that's got a sensor on there for when you walk into the bathroom late at night that clicks on. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so we're seeing a lot of people out there who are coming and kind of taking that idea again and scaling that to create more facilities and operational based efficiencies. But I think that is literally just the beginning for the types of innovation. But those are a couple examples that I'm seeing people work pretty aggressively on right now.
Ali, Josh mentioned sensors. What are some other tools out there for climate mitigation? How do you go about developing, funding those, implementing them?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, there's a range of direct investments the department makes, and so in the FY23 President's budget, for instance, there's over $3 billion in investments that have been identified as supporting either climate mitigation or adaptation. So, there's a substantial amount of resources that have been both identified and reoriented to support climate mitigation and adaptation. And I would say, in terms of key programs, I think one of them is certainly the defense-wide programs that Kim oversees. But more broadly, we do have a concerted effort to build out the capacity and the expertise needed to transition to 100% carbon pollution-free electricity, right? So that's teaming up the Department of Energy, General Services Administration, to really have a whole of government approach to leverage the purchasing power of the government. We're working with renewable energy suppliers and state regulators to better understand those markets, to really make sure we are all coordinating and rowing in the same direction to speed that adoption of carbon-free electricity. And I would also add, sort of getting at some of the innovation questions that were talked about earlier. The department oversees a large military construction program, which, despite that military construction, it's actually a really important tool for the department to deploy and field cybersecure microgrids, on-site power generation, energy storage. And this is the department's energy resilience and conservation investment program. And this is, gone up from less than about $200 million 5 years ago to over $500 million in the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act. And I think this program really illustrates the synergy between efficiency, between the use of carbon-free electricity, of on-site power generation with these mission imperatives. And so each ERSIT project is designed to reduce, if not eliminate, greenhouse gas emissions, also improve resilience and increase in the department's ability to operate in a contested homeland. And then finally, just from a programmatic perspective, I think third-party financing is something that I should mention, and that these are contractual agreements that leverage private sector resources up front that enable us to get long-term energy savings, whether that's energy savings performance contracts, utility energy services contracts. The private sector has invested over $5.5 billion in department projects over the last 10 years. And just in calendar year 2023 alone, we expect 36 third-party financing projects with an award value over $1 million, or $1 billion, pardon me. So these really help us get after not just, I would say, sort of a one-time fix, but really allow for that systemic cumulative change that we really need to hit the goals established in the executive order.
Kim, before we move on from that kind of tools and solutions, how we use less part of the conversation, anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, please. So when we, from the Department of Defense perspective, consider the climate challenges, we look at the innovation from two perspectives. We look at what can we do to combat climate crisis or combat the climate crisis? And we also look at how can we increase resilience to climate change? And so our portfolio within the innovation space addresses it from both of those facets, right? So we'd love to certainly stop the climate change, right? We want to understand that. We'll need to understand that, and we'll need to understand it so that we can decide the type of innovation that we need to invest in. But at the same time, we need to increase resilience. It's clear that we're having, climate change effects. And so one of the things that we're doing within the department is we've stood up a new climate resilience program area within CERTIP and ESTCP. And what that will do is that area is going to complement the DoD climate change plans to provide technologies, processes, and decision support to advance these established plans. So there are certainly near-term goals, which Ali was discussing, Josh has been discussing, and those are going to be monumentally critical to addressing both of these facets. But at the same time, we're needing to invest now in that innovation so we can really keep moving the needle there.
Kim, before we pivot to a new area, I think our audience will note, just looking at your bio, there's a lot in it in sort of weapons research. You know, you came from Army Research Lab, advanced within DoD. We're talking decarbonization today, but is there a nexus between decarbonization and like weapons policy or practice for DoD?
So certainly the Department of Defense and our operations are, not to use the, pun intended here, it is an ecosystem, right? And so we are systems of systems in the Department of Defense, and whether we're going to be able to put an energy on target through a weapon, we need to have a platform that's going to help us get there. We're going to need the logistics to help us get there. We're going to need an industrial base within the United States that is going to be sustainable. And so interestingly enough, as a postdoc at the Army Research Lab, I had the coolest job as a chemist. I was an energetic materials formulator. I mixed molecules together that literally were explosives. And my first project I worked on was how can we work with energetic materials that are environmentally friendly and are not going to contaminate our testing ranges. And so that was back in 2009, we were considering aspects like that. Like, what can we do from that molecular level to ensure that the public that entrusts us as the Department of Defense is not affected by our training practices? So yeah, in summary, we're an ecosystem of systems within the Department of Defense, and every lever you turn has possible downfield effects there.
Yeah, and if I could, George, I'd add to that by saying there's a couple of pretty significant policy statements that have come out that connect the role of decarbonization or efficiency and military capability. And that was in April of 2022, the Deputy Secretary of Defense issued guidance to the military departments that all new capabilities being developed are going to reduce energy demand and increase energy supportability, which is the ability to support a system in combat. And so that's pretty significant. And the whole department is reorienting around that, as well as in the National Defense Strategy that talks about the role of clean energy in supporting operations in contested environments. emissions. And so, that's something that I think, there's clear climate imperatives to do what we're doing, but there's an equally significant set of mission imperatives. And I think that those have been articulated, I think, in a pretty tight way.
Josh, the ecosystem term I love for this, that ecosystem is big for the Department of Defense. Could you give our audience a sense of maybe the size, the scope, the scale that we're talking about relative to decarbonization and DoD?
Yes, certainly. And I think, again, this is one of those situations where it's useful to have some analogs from the private sector as well. So if you think about the sort of scope 3 or supply chain issues that are associated with decarbonization, you look at an organization like the DoD, and you try to think, what are the ways that I could potentially decarb this? What are the levers that I could approach with? And interestingly, as hard as we work, and I have quite a bit of experience in oil and gas, including with super majors, you really have to add up the sum total of their inventory to even come close to what we're looking at from a DoD standpoint. So well over $100 billion of global inventory. So I think that that coupled with the fact that it spans across so many different category types, as opposed to something, in the private sector, we often have a much narrower mission, so to speak, around, delivering oil and gas, to go back to that example. Here we're looking at everything from, combat assets to, just simple routes that you may do during the day to deliver a package, for example. So I think that those two sort of axes around the scope and the variety of what the DoD is facing really highlights the difficulty and the complexity of what it takes to kind of decarbonize a system like this. It is truly an ecosystem unto itself. There aren't any great analogs out there. You kind of have to piece them apart to make it work.
Ali, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but do you have any numbers or statistics around the size of DoD's current carbon footprint? I mean, what are you tackling here?
Sure. So, first of all, I'd note that, DoD emissions have actually decreased by by over a third since 2008. So, substantial progress there. Now, some of that is from, the downsizing of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but, a large portion of that is about steady, deliberative progress in reducing our emissions. And so where does that leave us today? Well, in fiscal year 21, which is last year we have full data for, DoD emissions total about 51 million metric tons. So kind of continuing on the idea of analogies, 51 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per me. We're about 3 times larger than Walmart's global footprint in 2021, but about half, or 55% of total emissions from commercial aircraft operations in the United States. So I think that's useful because it gives you a sense of, we're big, but there's some things out there that are much bigger, right? So it's useful to keep that in mind. And building on also what Josh noted, about 60% of our emissions come from combat forces, with the remainder coming from the generation of electricity that we use on our bases, and natural gas and other fossil fuels used to heat and power industrial processes on bases. So you get a sense of the complexity of the system, right? It's not going to have a silver bullet that gets all of them. I think certainly as we think about over the long run, we're going to be able to focus on some near midterm targets, right, that are more amenable to an energy transition, right? Thinking a lot about our bases and our installations and what happens there. But some of our combat capabilities, particularly aircraft, ships, they're likely going to be among the last to transition. And I think that really tees up this idea of sustainable aviation fuels, of low carbon fuels. And that's something that the department's been trying to stay in alignment with the commercial sector. So as new sustainable aviation fuels are approved, for example, to be used in the commercial marketplace, we are aligning ourselves with those standards as well, so that all of our equipment is qualified to use those fuels wherever they might encounter them around the globe.
Kim, a common cliche I hear hosting these types of programs is this phrase, boil the ocean. And 51 million metric tons seems like an ocean, and as Ali said, there's no silver bullet here. Just sort of innovation-wise, research and development focal areas, do you come at that big number with a holistic approach? Do you instead try and take small bites around the edges, or is it yes and yes, I gotta walk and chew gum at the same time?
So interestingly enough, strategy is what you do when you need to accomplish a goal and you have limited resources. And so what's really great about our office within OSD with Ali and his policy counterparts, me and my innovation counterparts, is we crosswalk that strategy. So what we don't want to do, and this is totally a DoD phrase, is to peanut butter spread the funding where you do a little of this, a little of that. What we try to do is annually put out calls for proposals that are based on multi-year strategic plans that allow us to get after the highest priority technology goals. So for example, right now in operational energy, we have 3 pillars that are priority pillars right now. We're looking at powering the force. So that's where we're looking at near-term efficiency improvements for current platforms and systems. We're looking at electrifying the battle space. So really moving away from those liquid fuels, the diesel engines that we typically use. And we're looking at commanding energy. And so how can we provide granular battle space awareness of, and really that monitoring of energy in the battle space? So that's the operational energy side. From the installation energy side, that's where we're looking at, right now we're prioritizing, as Josh spoke about, taking those innovations that are occurring in the commercial space and making those DoD appropriate. So you could imagine that I haven't been able to plug in a thumb drive into my computer since before I started working, right? I mean, that was like a big thing. Can't plug in a thumb drive. So would it be, it would be exceedingly challenging to go put in unnamed companies' smart thermostat, lock that into the DoD network and, spread that data out, right? So there's a lot of cybersecurity issues that we're focused on right now from the energy standpoint. We're also looking at, from an installation energy side, the priority of, again, electrifying our installations. And so part of that is, where appropriate, moving to heat pump type technologies. Along with that, if you can't generate that electricity in a clean way, it doesn't make sense to move to heat pumps. So we're looking at that. A big part of that is, working with our local utilities, working with our local regulators. In summary, it's a very complex problem, but we are motivated and we are committed to making sure that, as a Department of Defense, that we're working towards this decarbonization.
Josh, I want to talk about budget as applies to this conversation too. Industry, government working together here and scaling and budgeting and building these advancements that Kim's team is sort of putting out there. You got to do it on a budget and got to do it on a timeline. I'm wondering if you have some, best practices in that area.
Yeah, well, I mean, budget is all about priority, right? So budget reflects what it is you want to focus your limited time and resources on. So going back to that sort of the description that Kim gave around strategy is what you do when you have limited resources, but you have to execute. I think the same is true of a budget, right? So that is truly where kind of the rubber meets the road. So in terms of what I think this is going to look like, we have a lot of the tools in our toolkit already. So I look at agencies that have very robust asset management programs are probably already looking at this and thinking, okay, well, I've got, these various asset classes that are going to be up for either major maintenance or replacement in the next several years. What is this going to look like? What are my paths to work on these? So is there an opportunity to slot in heat pumps? What does that investment look like versus a conventional replacement? And so I think that, a lot of this is really just taking some of our traditional ways that we look at developing budget, and then making sure that we appropriately slot in these greener alternatives, or the alternatives that fit with the mission that we're all speaking about today. So I think that there are a variety of different ways you can do that. We've seen clients who have instituted an internal carbon price, so they can look at two competing project types and sort of weigh them fairly based on the CO2 equivalent that they might put out. But I think, when it comes down to it, again, budget is really a reflection of what we care about and what we would want to put our time and effort towards. And I think you're going to just increasingly see agencies spending more time figuring out how to make sure these alternatives get on that list and get the funding they need.
Kim, look into your crystal ball for us. I mean, if what you and Ali are putting together now works in a really big, impactful way, what will the department be able to do in the future that it can't do now or couldn't do before?
So I think, in addition to clearly the mission we have for addressing climate change, a parallel goal of that is resilience. And we're going to be able to be resilient to weather events. You can look at what's happened with some of our installations when we have major hurricanes come in. Look at Tyndall Air Force Base as an example. We are dramatically invested in making sure that our DoD lands and our infrastructure are resilient. That will be new. We are doing that now. We're successful at doing that now, but I expect there to be really an exponential augmentation there for us to have resilient installations. Resilient installations also mean that we have resilient training and we have resilient readiness. So I think we'll see a strong strengthening of our forces as a result of that. Putting my weapons hat back on, when we consider operational energy, we certainly talk about contested environments and what that means from a communication standpoint, from a kinetic energy standpoint, from an ability to fight standpoint. As our installations will become resilient, I also believe that our operational forces are going to become much more resilient and able to have many more degrees of freedom as they're maneuvering and fighting.
Ali, I'm wondering if you can also kind of paint me a picture of the communication chain outside of DoD, just because of this kind of pool of carbon that you have to tackle in the department. And Kim's point that, natural disasters could be an application here. Certainly national security is an area of opportunity. I'm wondering if there's communication outside of DoD that happens with, the State Department or FEMA, for an example. What are they trying to learn from you? What kind of info are you sharing across the transom?
Well, let's see. I would answer that in a couple ways. I think certainly on the adaptation side, in terms of how do we prepare ourselves for climate change, right, and dealing with the consequences of that. The climate adaptation plan the department's put out, I think is pretty good. I think it's been recognized as a really comprehensive approach to adaptation. I think as we work with other departments, we're all going to learn from each other to do that. In terms of the mitigation side, there is certainly a lot of collaboration going on at a technical level with the Department of Energy, and certainly a lot of the work they have done, specifically as it relates to zero emission vehicles, I think is important. But also some of the investments that have come forward in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, pretty significant impact on not directly on the Department of Defense, but on that energy ecosystem we're going to be tapping into. And so I think a lot of these technologies and innovations that we're looking for, they're going to be supported by some of these new investments. And I think we are tracking that closely to make sure that we are quick adopters of those improvements. And then I would kind of on a more direct note, I would just add that, each year there's a range of call for proposals, right, that Kim's team leads and others that are going to give a very clear sense of here's what the department's looking for and why, right, and making that connection to strategic goals that the department has. And so I think that's another mechanism for communicating sort of how the department is thinking about this, and how climate mitigation and adaptation fit into the strategic picture.
Josh, as we come to a close in this great conversation, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time on data. How can organizations track decarbonization in real, tangible terms? How do they set benchmarks for improvement? Can you go into some detail there?
Sure. Well, I think that the primary way that you have to start thinking about data in the decarbonization space, obviously, is having a good GHG inventory and knowing where it is, what emission types you're looking at, and how you can kind of build that hit list of the top emitters and what the underlying assets are. So that's where we typically start our work, is just making sure that that underlying data kind of works, that the methodologies that underpin it are sound, and that there is consensus around the fact that this is maybe not necessarily a gold standard data set yet, but at least approaching kind of a silver. And then following that, you're able to really get it into some of the more interesting tools that we've been working on, including one that we've got called Pathways, that really let you take and kind of model those out. So to Kim and Ollie's point, so once you have this sort of register of initiatives and opportunities that you want to take regarding decarbonization, the next trick is then to forecast that out and use the best crystal ball that we've got to understand what that could look like in the future. Are we going to actually hit both the 2050 and the intermediate goals for carbon-free electricity and others? So that's really where we tend to move to next, is that more flexible scenario modeling that helps you understand what that glide path looks like, and then what the interactions are between the different initiatives, because based on funding and just operational realities on the ground, the choices that you make are going to interact with one another too. So if I decide to turn over a big chunk of my light duty vehicle fleet and make those electric vehicles, that's then going to require that I set aside and can model out, well, what's the capital build for the supporting infrastructure? So can I actually plug all these in and get them charged? And so that's necessarily going to kind of take you and make you step back and think about how you're prioritizing, what that looks like on the time scale. So data part and parcel to the sort of experience and very necessary for climate change. And I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg as far as a few providers in the space. But it all starts kind of with that GHG inventory. And if you're talking about the resilience side of things, what your vulnerability looks like, which we also do kind of risk and peril assessments on with some of our in-house tools as well.
Kim, I was watching you out of the corner of my eye and something resonated in there for you. Tie a bow on this program for us, would you?
All right, sure. So I'll tie it two bows on. I'll give you two bows. So my first bow here is to tap into what Josh is saying. And so we from the innovation side have recognized that the importance of this data. And so we're investing right now actually in data standardization across the services. You can imagine that sometimes the Army does things differently than the Navy does, the Air Force does the Marines. And so what we are doing, and what's nicely postured for us out of the Office of Secretary of Defense, is that we're able to help coordinate that from a research and development standpoint. So we are investing in technologies and studies that are allowing us to facilitate collaboration on this data, We need to develop best practices and methodologies for DoD specific data collection. We need to be able to standardize that data. We need to be able to database that data. And finally, we need to be able to have data accessibility. And so just as an example, my CERTUP, which is our earlier research and development program, previously funded the development of a DoD regional sea level rise, which we call the dorsal database. And that has been implemented. It's being used to support decision makers and planners at coastal installations. We'll be doing the same thing, certainly with our energy aspects, the data standardization there. And we have a long track record of actually putting that into decision tools for policymakers and decision makers. My final bow that I'll tack on here is that I've been in R&D my entire career. And never has a time been this rife with opportunity. Wish we weren't in this situation, but we are. We have, I believe, really unprecedented coordination between our technology base within the U.S., within our business decision makers, within the policy decision makers, within the Department of Defense, within our other federal agencies, with the administration. We're all committed to this. And not only that, our R&D is more successful than I typically see it being, right? And it's because we have all these folks here that are working together and making these good decisions. So I'm going to leave it as I'm optimistic that we will make major impacts here in the climate area. It is going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of innovation. It's going to take a lot of commitment. But I'm confident that we have the momentum right now, and I look forward to continuing that momentum.
Well, Kim, Ollie, Josh, maybe my favorite conversation of the entire year. What an exciting field all three of you are in. Thanks for taking time for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Most definitely. Thank you.
To our
Thanks so
audience,
much.
thanks for tuning in. A big thanks to KPMG for making programs like this one possible. Keep an eye on GovExec.com for the latest decarbonization headlines. We'll be back with more events in this Modern Government series very soon. For GovExec, I'm George Jackson. Have a great day.